Start investing in gold and silver at sdbullion.com today and join over 35,000 precious metals investors who have made the switch to the lowest gold and silver prices in the industry. SD Bullion recently claimed a spot on the prestigious Inc. 500, making them one of the fastest growing bullion companies in the United States. With low bullion prices and over-the-top customer service, SD Bullion is setting the standard for precious metals transactions. Visit www.sdbullion.com today. Start saving on every precious metals purchase you make.
Hey everyone, this is Elijah Johnson with SilverDoctors.com, and with us today is Jeff Berwick from the Dollar Vigilante. Jeff, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure, Elijah.
All right, well, I'd first like to discuss Bitcoin. You've recently reported that China is moving into Bitcoin en masse. Can you expand on this?
Sure, yeah, that's basically what I said, but I didn't mean every single person in China is buying Bitcoin or anything like that. But it's definitely been the one country in the world where it's really caught on. It's caught on way more than any other country I can think of. If you look at the actual amount of Bitcoin being transferred on, and you can watch that in real time. You just go to fiatleak.com. It's pretty much most of the Bitcoin is going to China right now, and it's been that way for quite a while. So yeah, absolutely, it's been one of the driving factors in the price of Bitcoin for the last while, and the main reason is because China, of course, has been doing quite well over the last decade or two because they've become quite capitalist. In fact, in many ways, they're much more capitalist than the U.S. now, as the U.S. is so socialist and almost communist now in many ways. So they've been booming. A lot of people, that's been generating massive amounts of wealth, as it does every single time you allow the free market or what true capitalism or free trade, actual true free trade. If you allow that to happen, you'll just have people doing incredibly well. That's happened every single time in human history. But still, to this point, people still haven't figured it out. But because of that, a lot of people in China are making a lot of money over the last few decades, a lot of billionaires being created, a lot of millionaires. And but China still has capital controls on the Chinese yuan. I believe it's every Chinese citizen or subject is allowed to take $50,000 worth of yuan every year outside of China. I think that's roughly the amount they're allowed. So you actually see every year, right at the start of the year, a lot of people take it out right away. And so that's why I think we saw Bitcoin really spike in the first few days of January, as I think a lot of people just started moving a lot of money around at that point. And of course, Bitcoin's the easiest way to move money anywhere in the world today, and the cheapest. It's just the best in every possible way, and it can't be stopped due to the capital controls. You just can't stop Bitcoin, which is another reason that people love it. So yeah, we've seen a lot of people in China just take on to it. And of course, Chinese also have a bit of I hate generalizing about a vast amount of people, about 1 billion people, but in general, the culture seems to be more open to things like risk taking and gambling to some extent. And so you're seeing a lot of traders getting onto Bitcoin and just trading it in China. You see so much trading going on there, and so that's, I think, one of the main reasons Bitcoin is really been doing quite well recently. And of course, we're seeing Bitcoin expanding all over the place, but there hasn't been one particular place quite like China.
Now, in what ways is the Chinese government kind of pushing back against Bitcoin? Because I know you said some of the Bitcoin withdrawals in China are suspended right now. Can you expand on this?
Yeah, it's been an ongoing sort of a struggle of the Chinese government and the Bank of China to kind of slow down this people adopting Bitcoin. This has been going on for years. It was a few years ago, I believe, that they tried to shut down a number of Bitcoin exchanges. I've heard on numerous occasions that China is making Bitcoin exchanges illegal and stuff like that. But the great thing about China is a lot of the people there just don't care what the government says. They're much more freedom-minded than people in the U.S. And they just don't care. They're not slaves like a lot of people in the West today, who whatever government says something, they just bow down to it like it's something they can never stand up to, or something like a bunch of slaves. But in China, they really a lot of people, they just don't care. There's even an entire city in China where they don't have a government. There's no real government involvement in anything, and they won't even allow the government to be there, which is great. And it's been booming, of course. That's exactly what you would expect. So that's what's been going on, is they've been trying to shut it down because they're realizing that it's really a lot of people are starting to move a lot of their assets outside of China using Bitcoin, but they really can't stop it completely. It's just too many people. There's too many things. The government isn't quite as big and massive as it is in the U.S. at this point, so it really can't just stop it. And there's absolutely no way to stop it except for using guns and going to offices and saying, if you do this, we're going to kidnap you and throw you in a cage, which is all government does anyway. So that's what's been going on. But most recently, last week, the Central Bank of China cracked down on a number of Bitcoin exchanges and said they're worried about money laundering. And of course, money laundering isn't something that's a criminal act by any means. It's actually avoiding a criminal act of taxation, which is just theft. So people trying to avoid being extorted by the government try to put their money all over the place. They call it money laundering. And so the Bank of China said, we're worried about your money laundering. People might be laundering money through here. So they somehow got a few of the exchanges to stop Bitcoin withdrawals for 1 month until they could get some of their anti-money laundering information on people. So they're basically trying to find out more information on their customers and things like that, which is what's been going on in the U.S. The U.S. already did that with Coinbase. So it's interesting. There's a few exchanges that are still operating. You can still withdraw your Bitcoin, but there's a few right now that you can't withdraw your Bitcoin at the moment. So that's going to be interesting because essentially all that Bitcoin is frozen at this moment in time. And we'll see what happens if they do lift that ban, which is say it will be a month, which, you can never trust the government. It could be forever, really. But if it's actually let loose in a month, that will be interesting. It'll be a time to watch for Bitcoin just to see what people do, whether they buy more or if they just start selling because they're worried that this might happen again in the future.
Now, what about in the U.S.? Has there been pushback by the American government against Bitcoin? And what do you see Trump doing, if anything, about Bitcoin?
Yeah, the U.S. has been interesting. It hasn't been too bad. In many ways, it's been Bitcoin has been allowed to operate. Of course, when the U.S. government first found out about it, that was about 2013. There was the first Bitcoin conference ever was held in San Jose, California, and the federal government went in and shut it down and actually put people in jail just for going to the conference. So typical government, when they find out about something they don't like that might threaten their monopoly on violence and a monopoly on banking and central banking and stuff like that, they just went and shut it down. But there's been a lot of Bitcoin activity. There's a lot of Bitcoin-related companies in the U.S. now. Of course, a lot of Bitcoin's related to technology, and a lot of Silicon Valley is in the U.S. So a lot of the activity is there. So they haven't really shut it down too much. There's been areas like, for example, New York State, which is one of the most fascist, out-of-control, anti-freedom places in the world. They actually instituted something called a bit license, that essentially made it so they put in so many rules and regulations on it that it's almost impossible to operate as a Bitcoin-related company in New York State now. So they basically shut it down that way. That's sort of like a backdoor way to try to slow down the growth of Bitcoin. But in general, you can still operate and you can still trade Bitcoin in the U.S. They're even trying to bring in a Bitcoin ETF now, which if that actually gets approved by the SEC, and of course the SEC is just another criminal government organization, but if they do allow it, that will actually increase the value of Bitcoin, in my opinion, dramatically. Not even 100% or 200%, but much more, because it will make it so much easier for people to actually get exposure to their portfolio in Bitcoin. So it's going to be interesting. But these governments change all the time. That's the thing. You can never trust the government. So, all it takes is one guy getting a payoff from somebody, and then he institutes a law and stuff like that. But as of right now, Bitcoin is not being cracked down very much on in the U.S., and so that's good. Every country is different, as I pointed out. I think Bitcoin's illegal in Thailand right now. I think it's illegal in Venezuela. It's a lot of the places where they have the worst sort of capital controls issues where they really try to crack down on it.
Now, looking at the Bitcoin charts, Bitcoin is actually close to its all-time high. It's right now around 1,000, and its all-time high, it looks like it was a little below 1,200. So what is your perspective on where Bitcoin is heading in the future? Because I think you've talked about this before, and you think that Bitcoin is headed much higher.
Yeah, absolutely. As I mentioned, if this ETF can get approved by the SEC, it will go exponentially higher, not immediately, but over the next couple of years, because the main issue with Bitcoin is that a lot of people still don't understand it. A lot of people are starting to catch on that they should probably start using it. They should have some exposure to it, but it's not super simple still to understand Bitcoin. And of course, most people have gone to government indoctrination camps for 12 years. And so that's where they got educated, and they don't really they're not really capable of thinking very well anymore. So it's really hard for people to even understand how to use Bitcoin. But of course, an ETF would just make it easy. It'd be like buying a stock on a stock exchange, which a lot of Americans are used to, or know how to do that, or even their money managers or their mutual fund manager, whoever, could then buy it. So that will be interesting. Of course, the adoption of Bitcoin just continues to expand. The usage of Bitcoin just continues to rise. So that's really what it takes for Bitcoin to continue to go up in price. It's all supply and demand. The more that people want Bitcoin, the more it will rise in price. It's just simple supply and demand. The negatives for Bitcoin that could hurt it is it's getting so used now that it's having actually a hard time keeping up with the growth. And the developers who are trying to develop Bitcoin have been slow to adopt new practices to increase the speed of Bitcoin. So we've seen some delays over the last year or so of people transferring Bitcoin. The Bitcoin mining fees, which are the cost the price will cost you to transfer, has been rising. You're seeing like an average price now for a transfer of nearly $1, which is up massively for Bitcoin. It's still absolutely nothing compared to PayPal or banks, bank wire transfer, anything like that, especially if you're transferring large amounts of money. It's absolutely nothing. But it is still, these are concerns. So there's issues. Bitcoin's only 8 years old as of right now. So it is a new technology. There's lots of things that could happen. We could see all this government stuff happening as well. So it's a big sort of, you look at the risk and you look at the reward, but in my opinion, the reward side way outweighs the risk side at this moment in time.
All right. Well, I'd like to move our focus now to, a Trump presidency, and Trump has been in office for a few weeks now. What is your perspective on the first few weeks that he's been in office?
It's been pretty much exactly what I expected. I actually predicted he would get elected. I could see he had the backing of the global elites. He's not an outsider by any means. Absolutely not. He's an old friend of the Clintons. What was one of the things that he said before he got elected? That he was going to put Hillary Clinton in jail. And then as soon as he got elected, he started saying, oh, no, they're good friends of mine. We've been friends for decades. I golfed with Bill all the time. I would never put them in jail. It's all typical politicians talk. This has happened for centuries. I don't know why people never figure it out. This whole system is just a big rigged system. You're never going to get what, true freedom out of the system, even if that's what people even wanted. I don't even know if people want that anymore. But as far as what he's done so far, some of the people will say some of the good things he's done, and I would agree with them, is he's sort of scrapped the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was a totally anti-freedom, anti-free trade deal, very massive fascist sort of a trade deal. But that deal was actually already dead in the water. It was not going anywhere. It was not being agreed to by anyone. So that was already dead. And then the other sort of big thing that a lot of people have said that he's done good is sort of fought back against this global warming hoax, and it is a total hoax. It's absolutely just a major hoax to put in a massive tax on people on the air that they actually breathe out of their mouth, CO2. It's actually insane, the whole thing, and all the lies they've told about global warming. We're seeing, Al Gore said by this year there would be no snow. There's people in the northeast of the U.S. under about 8 feet of snow right now. It's just a total scam. But that's another case where if you looked at the numbers of the polls, people didn't care at all about global warming. It was not going anywhere. No one wanted to see any major legislation put in about global warming. I think it was like 2% of Americans thought it was important. So that was another one that was already dead in the water. So I think they kind of put him out there to say, oh, look, I killed those things, so I am really a freedom fighter. I am getting rid of all these major fascists and then this huge globalist elites, the central bankers and all that. But he's not. He's talked about maybe auditing the Fed, but you don't really need to audit the Fed. We know exactly what it does. What you need is to shut it down immediately. But he would never do that. There's no chance of that. He's definitely not closing down the IRS, the biggest extortion racket in the U.S., which extorts many Americans for half the money they make every year. There's no talk about that. So there's no freedom aspect to him at all. He's actually raising the wars. A few of the things he talked about before he got in was how he's going to get rid of a lot of these wars that Nobel Peace Prize winner Barack Obama had started and been involved in all over the world. And he's just increased them. He's sold arms now to Saudi Arabia, one of the biggest terrorist states in the world. So really, I don't see any real change, any significant, important change at all so far. I think it's just the same as Bush, the same as Obama, and now it's Trump. It's just a new name. It's a new orange tinge to it, and that's about it.
You've talked about how some of Trump's policy ideas are really just, as you said, silly. For example, building a wall across the southern border.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a one big one that so many people really want. We have to crack down on people selling the Americans cheap products that somehow take away their jobs, which totally doesn't. That's crazy. These people don't understand economics at all, and so Trump sort of ran on the thing. Well, we're going to build a wall across an entire continent. And that will stop it. Of course, it wouldn't. All you need to get over a wall is a ladder, or under it is a shovel. And of course, there's two oceans on either side. So if you have a boat, that's pretty good too. So it's totally just silly to even talk about. But then he said, "Oh, I'm going to make Mexico pay for it." And by that, he means he's going to put a tariff on any Mexican products of something like 20% or something like that. Which all that will do, Mexico's not going to pay for it. That will be U.S. citizens, U.S. customers who pay for it. Anyone who's buying any Mexican products will pay an additional 20%, and that money will go to the U.S. government. Hey, it's another tax. So it's absolutely crazy what they're talking about there. It actually will damage the U.S. economy massively if he follows through on any of this stuff, because all these protectionist policies will just have the ultimate effect of reducing the demand for the U.S. dollar. And by doing that, he'll actually crash the dollar dramatically. So but if he does it, Mexico's two biggest products that they import into the U.S. is food and oil. So if he wants to make food and oil 20% more expensive, that'll be interesting. Americans are already paycheck to paycheck. Most of them, most people are just totally just broke in the U.S. now after decades of central bank inflation, massive taxation and regulation that kill all the jobs and industries and everything. So you're seeing just people getting killed by those tariffs, and then they're going to get killed when the U.S. dollar goes down because of those. There'll be less demand for dollars because of it. So then the price of everything else will rise dramatically as well. So we'll see nearly a hyperinflation scenario if Trump follows through with his big plan to help save Americans.
All right. Well, Jeff Berwick, thank you so much for joining us today. Now, one last question I was going to ask you is, what do you think the best thing Trump could do with this broken system? Because you've talked about how the system is really broken. You've talked about before how a collapse is inevitable, and Trump has two options. He can either keep inflating, or he can default on the debt and let the system crash. Can you explain these two scenarios and which would be better for the country?
Yeah, it has come down to two scenarios, two options. So these are the only two options available right now to Trump or the U.S. federal government, and it's because of the massive amount of debt now. The U.S. has almost $20 trillion worth of debt. That's up nearly 100% from 2008 when Barack Obama first became president. So within the span of 8 years, the U.S. national debt has nearly doubled. That's absolute insanity. No one's talking about this. You never heard that talked about when it was Hillary Clinton versus Donald Trump in the debates or anything. You never hear it talked about on the news, on the mainstream media, the fake news, CNN. They don't talk about any of this stuff. It's the only question that matters. It's the only important thing. When you have $20 trillion in debt, and that's not all of it, because there's so many liabilities of money that they've already taken in that they're supposed to spend, things like socialist insecurity, things like Medicare and Medicaid. They've just been taking a lot of that money in, and there's been a surplus in the past. There isn't anymore, but in the past there was, and they just spent it all. So that they actually owe that money to supposedly these systems like Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid, but they have no way of actually paying for it. The U.S. government is bankrupt. The only way to pay for it is to continue printing money. So this is going to end at some point, and the total debt and liabilities is well over $100 trillion now, which if you divide it by 300 and some odd million people in the U.S., that's $250,000 per person of U.S. government debt and liabilities that is overhanging it. So a family of four in the U.S., any typical family of four, just go to Cleveland, Ohio, open the door to a house. If it's a family of four, that's $1 million worth of U.S. government debt and liabilities overhanging that one house. This goes for every single house in the U.S. This is a beyond bankrupt situation, and it's going to end soon. This cannot go on much longer, and the debt just continues to pile up, even under Trump. I haven't seen anything to do with actually really reducing debt much at all. In fact, he's talked about increasing the amount they want to spend on infrastructure and on the military, because, of course, the U.S. military spending more than the the next 10 countries after it, their combined military budgets, the U.S. military spends more than that. It's not enough because, of course, if you want to terrorize the entire world, you need more money. You need more than trillions. And, of course, the Pentagon, or the pentagram, as I call it, keeps losing money. The last amount they said they lost was $6 trillion. It's just gone. So that's the situation. So the only the things that the government has a choice on is, are they going to continue to print money with the Federal Reserve, with this quantitative easing and interest rates near 0%, or even going into negative over the next few years until the U.S. dollar is worthless in a hyperinflation, or are they just going to default on the debt? That's something Trump actually talked about a little bit before he got elected, was how they should renegotiate the debt. Well, any sort of renegotiation is a default, and it will have massive, massive repercussions because U.S. debt, Treasury debt, is such a big part of the entire world financial system now. Most banks, many major companies, they hold a lot of their money, stupidly in my opinion, and actually immorally, in U.S. government debt. So if all of a sudden that debt is worth 30% less, or 50%, or 100%, which it really should be, that will cause a massive, massive depression, unlike anything we've ever seen in the history of the world. So that's the best case scenario, because if that happened, you'd still have a functioning economy. You'd just be decimated for a period of time, maybe a year or two. It'd just be horrible, absolute worst that anyone's ever seen. But then it could rebuild. But in a hyperinflation, that actually decimates the entire economy. Nothing can even function unless everyone starts using Bitcoin and silver and gold, which hopefully they will, and hopefully people are smart enough to do that. But if they don't, and the dollar is hyperinflating, just like you see in Venezuela or in Zimbabwe, all of a sudden everything just stops because there's no currency to be used. And so the entire economy goes essentially to zero. That's actually a worst case scenario, and that would be even worse. But that looks like the direction in which they're headed. But we'll see what happens. But either way, it's going to be incredibly bad, and it's going to happen soon. We're not talking decades, we're talking years, and we might even be talking months. But we're definitely not talking more than 5 years max. I can't even imagine 10, but 5 years, in my opinion, maximum, before all this system falls apart. And that's the best case scenario. So there is no good way out of this. This has been built now for decades, and we'll see how it all plays out, but it's not going to be good for most people.
And for our new viewers who haven't heard our interviews before, what is your perspective on how people can prepare for this crisis?
Well, a big part of it is just getting if you have assets, and a lot of people don't nowadays, as I mentioned, but if you do, to get a lot of them outside of the financial system. They've been, you can just see what happens in places like Greece when they shut down the banks a couple of years ago. A lot of people, as soon as they shut down the banks, they all got in line to take their money out of the bank. That's a little late. You want to do that before they do that. And what happened in Greece is going to happen all throughout Europe. It's going to happen in the US, it's going to happen in Canada, it's going to happen in Australia. All those countries have bank bail-in clauses now, just like they did in Cyprus, when they bailed in the banks and took 50% of anyone with any large amount of money. They just took 50% of it when they closed the banks. And that's going to happen everywhere. As I mentioned, when this sort of financial collapse happens, all the banks are going to be insolvent. So all the banks will close. So people should just get most of their assets outside of the financial system, get your money outside of the bank. I don't even care if it's so-called insured by the bankrupt government, and not to mention that the bank insurance company that secures the bank deposits in the U.S. is absolutely beyond bankrupt also, on top of the U.S. government being bankrupt. So the whole thing's bankrupt. So get your assets outside, get into things like precious metals, gold, silver, get into Bitcoin to some extent, not a massive amount perhaps. It is still new, and there is some risks with it, unlike silver and gold, which won't go to zero anytime in the near future unless someone learns how to make it alchemically. But other than that, just get outside, get some of your assets into hard assets, things like foreign farmland and things like that. I talk about that in our newsletter a little bit. And just essentially things that the U.S. government can't steal and the Federal Reserve can't inflate away. That's what you want to be into.
All right. Once again, Jeff Berwick, thank you so much for your time. Did you want to share with the viewers where they can find you online? And I know you have a couple conferences coming up if you'd like to tell our viewers about that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. They can find me at the dollarvigilante.com, and just look up on YouTube if you're into YouTube, Dollar Vigilante. We do a video almost every day. And yeah, we have a couple conferences coming up this month. On February 24th, we have the Dollar Vigilante Internationalization and Investment Summit in Acapulco, Mexico. We have so many great speakers. I'll be there, and our senior analyst of the Dollar Vigilante, Ed Bugos. Then we have a number of excellent speakers, so I'm sure you're aware of many of them, including Bill Murphy of the GATA, the Gold Antitrust Action Committee. He'll be one of the speakers. David Morgan, probably one of the top sort of silver analysts, in my opinion, in the world, will be there. Bix Weir of Road to Ruta, really interesting guy with interesting theories on how this whole fallout's going to take place. And Colin Cattell of Palisade Capital, a really amazing young guy who's doing amazing investment stuff in the mining markets, and all kinds of other people. So check that out at tdvinvestmentsummit.com. And then after that, the day after, we have a 4-day voluntarist or / anarcho-capitalist conference called Anarchapulco, with all the top sort of freedom people from across the world will be there. And that's 4 straight days. So 5 days total of events, all in Acapulco at the end of this month.
Once again, Jeff Berwick, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure.